It was horrible. An awful, bloody series of crimes, rapes, and murders so grotesque that they terrified a nation. For over a decade, a killer stalked the women of Northern California. He taunted and insulted his hunters. He played with his victims. He would phone them before his attacks to frighten them even more. And no one was able to catch him. That is until years, decades later, a new technology of investigative forensic science came on the scene, and finally, the police had a suspect in their sights. I'm Glynn, and this is Crime Waves. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Crime Waves. I'm Glynn, a professor of investigations here at the University of New Haven. And each week, my students, this time it's Eric Krebs and Erin Griffin, we examine a particular aspect of crime, corruption, mafia, and murder. And today, we're going to examine a relatively new technique in forensic detective work. It's called forensic genealogy. It's only been around for a few years, but it's revolutionizing cold cases. And every week there are crimes and murders being solved using this new type of investigation. However, there are also all kinds of ethical and moral questions about forensic genealogy, questions that get to the very heart of who we are as human beings, questions that challenge many things about how we look at ourselves, how we know ourselves, how we view our essential identity. Our guest is an expert in this field, Professor Glynn, also of the University of New Haven. Her curiosity, her intelligence, and her passion is for forensic detective work. She has been with the largest provider of forensic services to the British police. After that, Claire got her PhD at the National University of Ireland in Galway in the study of molecular medicine and the profiles of breast cancer. And Claire, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Glynn.
Claire, who and what was going on in California in the 1970s and 1980s with this Golden State Killer?
Well, back in the mid-1970s up to the mid-1980s, essentially there was this serial rapist and killer that was terrorizing Sacramento and Southern California. He had many different names, such as the original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, which he became largely known to be the Golden State Killer later on. He's known to have murdered at least 13 people, raped at least 50 women, and having burglarized at least 120 homes over this 10 to 15 year period.
And he also seemed to, what made him so terrifying was that he seemed to enjoy it.
Yes.
He would have these phone calls, one of which will feature later on in our interview, where he would phone people up before he would do the attack and taunt them.
Absolutely. And if you listen to those phone calls, it really is one of the most terrifying things ever to listen to, where he whispers into the phone, "I will kill you." So he got great enjoyment out of terrorizing his victims and really scaring them to an unbelievable amount.
And he also got enjoyment out of kind of taunting the police.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed that he kind of knew what they were doing one or two steps before they were going to do it.
And that led the police also to suspect at the time and in the 20 years since that perhaps he was a member of law enforcement himself, or at one point they suspected that he was part of the military also, because he seemed to have these skills and techniques that not your average citizen would have.
Such as?
Stalking and being very stealth through, like, lying out in people's gardens late at night, approaching windows. He knew how to do it very stealthily and sleuthily so that he wouldn't be caught.
All those kind of things. And he also knew stuff about the investigations as well, because no one was able to catch him. I mean, mine and your background is the Jack the Ripper, the greatest unsolved mass murder of late 1890s and early 1900s in London. He has that kind of feel to it, doesn't he?
It absolutely does. And you can't deny that he must have had some sort of knowledge about evidence and leaving behind evidence.
Why?
Although there was some DNA evidence that connected several of the crime scenes. And ultimately, that's what led to him being caught and being able to link those crime scenes together.
So he's establishing this reign of terror in Sacramento, in that area of California in the 1970s and 1880s. Mm-hmm. The cops can't catch him. The detectives, his investigative journalists that we'll get to later on in the episode, trying to track down who this person might be. Nothing happens in the case for 20, 25 years. What is the change? What happens then?
Well, I mean, it's the realization that DNA can identify people. If you think about the birth of forensic DNA profiling, that began in 1984 with Sir Alec Jeffreys in the University of Leicester over in England. Sir Alec Jeffreys wasn't a forensic DNA scientist because that didn't exist at the time.
Yes.
He was a traditional geneticist and a renowned geneticist at that. And it was accidentally discovered. Like I like to think most accidents are always for great things. If you think of champagne, it was accidentally discovered.
Or Fleming and penicillin. He leaves the window open and the microbes of beer float across the road from the pub across the street.
Absolutely. Sir Alec Jeffreys was actually looking at blood samples from related individuals. It was actually his lab tech and his lab tech sister and mother and aunt, and was actually looking at pulling the DNA apart to see the similarities between them. But actually what he discovered, he set his experiment up on a Friday afternoon, came back in on a Monday morning and realized there's actually distinct differences between them. And it was at that point that he realized, hey, this could be really useful for identifying individuals in a forensic investigation. And that was the birth of it. That was September 10th, 1984. So 36 years later, we're still using it and has become much more refined and much more sophisticated and allowing us to have much more discriminatory power with it.
It's one particular section of that DNA, because here, of course, at the University of New Haven, we have the Sherlock Holmes of America, Henry C. Lee, who's really pushed that forward. You guys do this work on a daily basis. It's extraordinary, going into laboratories and seeing you cracking cases and doing more research and all kinds of stuff. And we'll have you back to talk about that. But there's a new form of that DNA investigative stuff, investigative work. I'm sorry to sound casual. Forensic genealogy, which is different than DNA. Or just the general DNA. What is forensic genealogy?
So if you think of our forensic DNA profiling that we've been using now for 30 plus years, we're looking at short tandem repeats, STRs, and those are located in the non-coding region of your genome, your genetic code. So if you think of your genetic code like 3.5 billion base pairs of information, it's a huge amount of data right there. But we're looking in forensic DNA profiling at the non-coding region, which really doesn't tell you anything personal about an individual. It's just like a barcode. It's essentially, you can match it up from a questioned sample to a known sample and say they match.
So just to go back for the non-scientists like myself, this barcode, I'm putting it in quotation marks, that's in every person's cells. In
every
all of our
single cell in your body, with the exception of your sex cells and your red blood cells.
We have these barcodes that you can use to identify, and then there's a general area which will say generic things about you. This is a human being from XY place in the world, and then there's specific ones saying this is Claire Glynn's DNA or this is Declan Hill's DNA. So now we're looking at the general code, not the specific one.
So we're looking at the coding regions, essentially, where there are differences between you and I. And this can be essentially one base pair. So if you imagine the 3.5 billion base pairs of information, one base pair can identify between you and me. So that's like, think of it like the Great Wall of China. And that's made of about 3.5 billion bricks. I don't know who counted them, but it is. And I like to think of that like the genetic code and a person's individual genetic code. And in our regular forensic DNA profiling, we're looking at about 20 bricks. But with our forensic genealogy, which is looking at single nucleotide polymorphisms, otherwise known as SNPs, we're looking at about 600,000 bricks. So getting so much more information as to what is the source of this brick? Where did it come from?
So I get that. I get the quantum leap between looking at 20 bricks, and I love that image of the Great Wall of China. Now you're looking at 600,000 bricks in the Great Wall of China, our barcode, our DNA barcode. What's the link between that and forensic detective work?
Because in those 600,000 bricks, you can identify where they came from, as in, is the person Irish? Are they Dutch? Did they come from Spain? You can get this biogeographical ancestry information from them. But also from a hereditary point of view, we obviously get 50% of our DNA from mom and 50% of our DNA from dad. So we've inherited that information from our parents. Now, if we can look at that information, put it into a database where there are other people that have put their DNA and see what the shared matches are. So I can, if my first cousin has also uploaded to the database, I'll get a shared percentage or shared centimorgans. And that'll give me an estimate of whether or not that person is a first cousin or a great aunt or a grandfather.
Now this, Claire, is the thing that those crazy aunts at Christmas or New Year's or whatever holiday you guys celebrate, wants us all to spit in a glass and send it off to 23andme.com or ancestry.com. That is the basis of that, hey, everyone, let's all see where our family came from, be it Ireland, Scandinavia, Ghana, wherever. Is that right?
Absolutely. That's where it started. So, we have the big five of these genetic testing companies, consumer-based genetic testing companies, where we have 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, MyHeritage, Living DNA, and My Family Tree. Right. And so everyone, Father's Day was just a couple of weeks ago, and there was big sales all over the place, and everyone is now getting these as gifts for Christmas and for birthdays and things. And it is that spit in a vial or swab the inside of your mouth and send it off to these companies. And I did it myself in 2016, and I'm a forensic DNA expert. I'm in the forensic field, but in 2016, not in my wildest dreams did I ever think that me doing that and submitting to this genetic testing company, that my data could ever be used in a criminal investigation by law enforcement.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, because I was wondering when we were going to get to that bridge. I get it now. I get that there's a whole bunch of people spitting into glass jars. I get that. How does that link with a criminal investigation?
So if you're going to spit in the glass vial and send it, or plastic vial, and send it to one of these companies, and then 4 weeks later, they send you a notification saying, here's your results. And like me, I was mainly doing it for the interest of, am I 100% Irish, or is there a mixed bag of other ethnicities there, or other biogeographical ancestry information there? What I didn't realize at the time, and now I obviously know a lot more about it, was that it actually matches you to genetic relatives that are also in that database. So I get weekly notifications of, you have a new genetic relative. And most often it's a distant cousin, a fourth to sixth cousin, and you share 0.5% of your DNA with each other. And did you know these people? And that doesn't... No. Well, I'm actually adopted, so I don't know any of them. So we have that.
So for you, this is... if you excuse the jump, but this is in some ways almost like a personal detective quest for you.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's why a lot of people do it these days, a lot of adoptees, or a lot of people that just don't know who their birth father is, or perhaps their birth mother is. Yeah, and so they do it to seek that out, to be their own genetic detective, essentially. And that's where it all began, because with these companies, you can download your raw DNA data, and it comes in this very hefty file with all of your genetic information in there, the sequence of A, G, T, and C, and what way they go. And you can upload that to a public online open source database called GEDmatch. And so people started doing that because GEDmatch was seen as, well, this takes all the top 5 and more of the companies that do this, and you can link to people from other companies. So if I'm in ancestry.com, but you're in 23andMe, and we're genetically related, we won't know, because your data is in Ancestry and mine is in 23andMe. But if we all upload to GEDmatch, we're all there. So it expands this database a lot more, and you can see your shared genetic
Now,
matches
hang on a
there.
second. My mind is going here. I've seen Minority Report. I've seen this creepy arm of big government or big corporations. They've now figured out who I am, but I don't have had to myself spat in that glass when crazy Auntie Gladys asked me to. It can be a second cousin somewhere who's now on his own volition loaded up to this public database, but I'm there because I'm his second cousin. I'm identified.
Well, you're not in the database, but a traditional genealogist can take your second cousin's name, let's call him Bob Hill.
Right.
And through census records, birth records, death records, marriage records, they can perform traditional genealogical analysis and build out your second cousin's family tree. And there's where you would pop up as a name. So you're not in the database, but it's the building of the family tree in the traditional sense after we've identified a match.
So what I wish I had done this. I haven't, unfortunately, but I have a series of love children around the world. I wish I'd done this, but I and they come looking for their dad, and for whatever reason, I don't want to admit that I have all these love children around the world. Isn't this an ethical issue? Isn't this an ethical problem?
Well, they tend to not really go that route to do it. For people that are searching birth parents, really people that do the genetic testing companies, they're looking for a match, a pretty close match on these databases or in the genetic testing company website. And while you're not going to pop up as a name, they might see perhaps your brother, maybe your brother submitted to one of these companies, and they can identify that person as an uncle, and therefore then they might use like traditional internet sleuthing by going through Facebook, identifying, if your brother has a Facebook page and has a 40th birthday party with you, and you're there in the pictures and you're tagged in it. So it really, it's not really about the DNA at the end of the day. It's about people being their own detectives and using all of these online tools that are out there for us, social media being one of the biggest.
But so it is that mixture of forensic, the tools, the techniques of forensic, which, as you were saying, in the 1980s, 1990s was just beginning, pioneering.
Yeah.
And now this social media, genealogy, ancestry, and me.com. But, let's not skip over this question about who we are. I think Germany and France actually made this illegal, did they not?
Yes. So they put in a policy saying that it's against the law to purchase or submit to direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies, which is your 23andMe, Ancestry.com, etc., because they want to protect the family. They see that there are some family secrets that should just be left alone, and that it could interrupt a family unit by discovering these secrets. It's not just like, affairs or, adultery or anything like that. There's people that have been conceived through sperm donors and their parents have never told them. There are people that have been adopted and they've never told them. It can disrupt a family. And, from a lot of my research and indeed reading Libby Copeland's book, The Lost Family, which is a phenomenal book, there are so many hundreds of thousands of people out there that this has been a massive positive impact on their life, but there's lots of people that it has created quite an amount of strife in their life, which is not a good thing. With France and Germany banning it, I don't necessarily agree with that because, secrets ultimately come out one way or another. And aren't you entitled to know where you came from? And what you choose to do with that is your own business.
I understand, speaking as an adopted child who was surrounded by love by her adopted parents. I have a friend in my spiritual group. He's in 70 plus. I won't mention his name. He's quite open about this. He even made a short video speaking about the pain that he still feels at 70 plus, not knowing who his birth parents are. Even if he just wants to say, hey, okay, I get it. I understood why at 16 you had to give me up, or 14 or whatever, or I just want to know who I am. And this gives people like yourself and him that possibility of cementing that hole in their knowledge and knowing who
Absolutely.
they are.
And for me, I met my birth mother when I was about 20 years old, and it wasn't through DNA or anything like that. It was simply contacting the adoption agency and saying, I was born on this date. I'd like to meet my birth parents, and they facilitate all that. And it was, for me, I was satisfying a curiosity. I was curious. I was like, what does she look like? Is she Marilyn Monroe? You kind of build these images up in your head of, well, maybe this is why I'm very picky about this, or maybe this is why I like kiwis. You're curious. But ultimately, for me, and everyone experiences it very differently, because it's your own personal experience and your own emotions. For me, once I had met her and we developed a relationship for a while, I wasn't curious about my birth father. I was like, okay, I've got an idea of where I come from, but my family unit that I have, my adoptive family, it was like hitting the jackpot. I mean, I got the best family in the whole wide world, and people might argue against that with me because they might think their own is. But my curiosity was satisfied. Had I not met her, perhaps now in my 30s, I might be, I wonder, and I might be doing the 23andMe tests to figure that out.
That's the pain, that's the longing, that's the emotion from one side of the equation. There's another I was looking at in the research before I talk with you, Claire, of a young woman who was adopted, brought up in America, went back to her home country of South Korea. Sorry, not her home country, but the place where her parents, her birthplace. And used this technique, used forensic genealogy to track down her father. And he is very clear, I don't want to meet you. You're not part of my family. And this seems to be a reissuing of that pain. There seems to be a reopening of wounds that were attempted to be closed.
And that's the Pandora's box that I think people are most anxious about. And certainly I see it everywhere I go, in terms of I'm part of a lot of genealogy Facebook groups and Twitters and all that. And lots of people have extremely good experiences. I just watched a video of a mother and daughter reuniting after 43 years. Just yesterday I watched it. They met at the airport. I cried watching it. It was beautiful. But then you see the posts from people of, I reached out and no one is responding to me. I've sent 6 messages and they've blocked me now on social media. And I'm like, okay, but you have to understand that you're not entitled to a relationship with them now. And you have to look at it from their point of view, that might have been a very, very traumatic time in their lives. We also don't know, people aren't always conceived through love and through sexual desire. Sometimes they're conceived in not so nice ways. And that has to be kind of considered. I mean, I think from my perspective in the industry that I work in, that's something that I'm perhaps more aware of than the average individual. So I do bring that in.
Let me bring in something. And by the way, listeners, we are going to get back to the Golden State Killer. We are going to show you the link between this forensic genealogy and solving cold cases. But I just want to touch on a couple more issues before we get back to crime, which is the raison d'etre of this podcast. What about the ethics of when they get it wrong? I've got a colleague, you've got a colleague, Angie Amber. She's been on this program many times. She, just as an intellectual exercise, she sent her spit in a jar off to 3 of the different 5 big companies. 2 came back with matching profiles, but 1 was completely different. What happens when they get it wrong?
So are you talking about not matching in terms of the biogeographical ancestry?
Yes. One was Scandinavian and the other 2 were Ghanaian or something like that.
So I've done the big 5. They're called the big 5 of Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, Living DNA, Family Tree. And they are all different. They're not wildly different, but they're different in the sense that they're working from a population database of their own. So it depends upon who's in that population database. So Ancestry.com has the highest number of people. They have 25 million, I think, something like that in theirs, whereas others might only have 8 or 10 million. So whenever you're working from a population database, and that's how you're doing your estimations of where this person comes from, the bigger the population you have, the more accurate your information is going to be. For MyHeritage, mine just says I'm 100% Irish. But with 23andMe in 2016, it said that I was 98.2% Irish. Whenever I opened the app in 2019, because it changes, it utilizes its newest database each time, or every couple of years or every year. It says now that I'm 92.8 Irish. And I'm like, wait a second, where did my 6% go? Is it that I've been living in America for 6 years and I'm losing my Irishness and my accent and things like that? Obviously not. It's more so that in that 3-year period from 2016 to 2019, more and more, millions of more people had contributed to the database, so they have more data to go off. So the estimations change.
So let's get back to crime. Mm-hmm. We've got this new technique. It's the marrying of forensic science, the stuff that you do every day, and genealogy, the stuff on these big 5 sites. You put it in, or actually not even you, your second cousin or your crazy aunt or whatever, puts it into the site, into this public database, GenMatch. What's the link between that and crime?
So it kind of came about a few years ago. I mean, forensic genealogy has actually been around for 18 odd years. Okay. It was Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, a highly recognized leader of this or expert of this in the world, that coined the term forensic genealogy back in 2002, I think it was. And that was using, like, we've got a name of someone, let's build out their family tree and see if we can identify these Jane and John Does, things like that. But it was with the birth of these direct-to-consumer testing companies, which, started well over 10 years ago, but really have exploded since 2016, 2014, that kind of area, that the databases started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So the forensic genealogists and the forensic scientists and the police investigators realized, hey, could we use this?
I see. I get it. So the cops, the police are now coming to the GenMatch site saying, we've got this DNA evidence. Is it matching with anyone?
So if they have DNA from a crime, like with the Golden State Killer, and there was DNA evidence linking multiple of the crime scenes, and so they take that DNA evidence and they have to process it a different way that we would normally with our forensic STR profiling, and essentially look at those 600,000 markers essentially and put it into a format. Yeah, the Great Wall of China. Look at it in a different format. Then they can give that essentially a code name, that DNA sample, and they can upload that to GenMatch. And then they can see who that crime scene sample shared matches are on the database.
Do you solve crimes that way?
Absolutely.
How many?
There's been hundreds in the last 2 years. Since 2018, April 25th, 2018, which was the announcement of the identification of the prime suspect for the Golden State Killer, it has exploded. There's been hundreds of cases where it has led to the identification of the prime suspect. Now, what I don't want confused for your listeners is that is the evidence, that the forensic genealogy is the evidence. It's not. It's the investigative lead. So if
let's take it back down to the Golden State Killer.
Yeah.
Let's like sample it right down. So we've now, since 2016, because of this increase in forensic genealogy database linked with DNA, we now have a potential new tool. So what did they do as police detectives?
So with the police detectives that were involved in the Golden State Killer investigation, they contacted Barbara Ray Venter, who is a worldwide known and extremely respected forensic genealogist, and said, hey, could we use this? Could we have this DNA evidence? This is one of the most prolific serial murderers and rapists of the United States history.
Yes.
Let's give it a go. And, when I think back to what those people, I wasn't involved in this in any way. Let's just put that out there. Right. But when I think back to the guts they had to try something brand new, that really hadn't been utilized in anything big previously in a case of this stature, I give them credit that they said, hey, let's try something
And what did
new.
they find out?
So
what happened?
So Barbara Ray Venter got the DNA evidence profiled into the format that they need for upload to GEDmatch. And they uploaded that sample under a code name into GEDmatch. And back then, law enforcement could access anything in GEDmatch, so anyone that had uploaded. And so then it basically ranks it. So the other thing to be clear about is in GEDmatch, if your DNA is uploaded to GEDmatch, I can't see your sequence. I can't see your AGTC and how it is arranged, but it tokenizes it and basically says how much we share. And it'll give you a percentage.
15%, 70%, 90%. Yeah. You've got me and the listeners. The police have loaded the code up. Is there a match?
So they got a match. I believe it was to like a second cousin or something like that. And so they can see that this person shares this approximation of DNA with that person. That person's name is in the database. Then they take that name and they do their traditional genealogy, whereby they build out the family tree via census records, marriage records, birth records, and build the family tree. And it led them to, 5 or 6 different individuals in that family tree. Then based upon what age that person would have been during the times these crimes were occurring, where that person was living during the times these crimes were occurring. Back then, they were pretty sure it was someone in their 30s or 40s, and they were definite that it was a male. And so then that led them to Joseph DeAngelo.
Who had been what?
Who had what?
He was a police officer, was he not?
He was a police officer during that time for only about 6 or 7 years. He wasn't a police officer his whole life.
But he knew the system. He was able to use those techniques that we talked about earlier on in the podcast to really play with their minds as he's terrorizing these poor victims.
Absolutely. And so then they basically staked him out and they watched him and they watched his behaviors. And then it was, they said, okay, we need to get a forensic DNA profile, not our genealogical profile, from this individual to compare to the crime scene samples. And I think it was a coffee cup that he threw out of his truck or something. And they collected that, swabbed it, did our traditional DNA profiling that we do every day in the crime lab. And boom, it was a match to the crime scene samples. So that allowed them to then arrest him for those crimes.
So they were following him around for a couple of weeks, waiting for him to, in the end, throw a coffee cup from Starbucks out the window of his car. Bam! They grab that cup, bring it back, and examine the saliva on the cup to see if there's a match for DNA.
Yeah.
Now, we're recording this on a Friday. I think on Monday, there's a major announcement coming out of California.
I am going to be on the edge of my toes all weekend because Monday is the hearing for Joseph DeAngelo. It's going to be held at the California State University in Sacramento in their ballroom, which holds about 2,000 people. They needed a venue that could hold a lot of people because there's about 150 victims' families and survivors as well that want to attend this and want to read their victim impact statements. And so that was selected. It was just announced yesterday that ballroom is going to be the location for the hearing. And it's anticipated that the Joseph DeAngelo will plead guilty in order to avoid a death penalty. And we'll wait and see what happens Monday, but I would suspect that the prosecution will probably accept that guilty plea in order to avoid a very lengthy, a very traumatic and very expensive trial. You can also it's also going to be live streamed online. So I'll definitely be logging in to see that. It's a landmark case.
Yeah, it's a landmark case for several reasons. It's a landmark case because really it's the first headline case using forensic genealogy, the first, as you said, of hundreds of these cases now going on. Claire, thank you so much for coming in. It's been a real eye-opening experience, both in terms of the science, in terms of that fantastic image of yours of the Great Wall of China and matching those genetic bricks, but also that conversation about who we are as people and how science is opening up questions that were previously, and when I say previously, I mean 5 years ago, were completely unknown to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
It's Declan here. A few days after that interview, Claire, Glynn, and I sat together, as you do in this COVID time, on computers dozens of miles away, watching as the man who was the Golden State Killer confessed to his dozens of murders and rapes. It was an awful session. And we at Crime Waves will do our best not to mention that killer's name to give him any more publicity. But thanks to forensic genealogy, a psychopathic thug, bully, and killer was caught at last. On behalf of all the producers, that's Bruce Barber, Eric Krebs, Aaron Griffin, Aidan Van Battenberg, and Ryan Decker, thank you for listening to Crime Waves. We'll see you next week in this, our mini-series of To Catch a Killer.